Much, Dragos. Appreciate it. The purpose of our meeting today is to explore different points of view around the topic of microgrids, the challenges, opportunities that the area represents going forward in the different contexts as well. It's obviously a quite complex topic. As always, we ask our speakers not to pitch or promote, but rather to add to collective understanding, and all have agreed to that, and Eric has agreed to uphold it as well, so I think we're headed in the right direction. We've asked them to talk about not just the trends that they see, but also the implications for opportunities that lie ahead and things that we really need to be thinking about to take advantage of those opportunities. So let us welcome our speakers and Eric.
Our speakers and Eric. No pitching, no promoting. It leaves me with nothing to say. So my name's Eric Wessoff. I've been off for about a year. I took a sabbatical from my last job as an editor-in-chief of Green Tech Media, and thank you to Churchill Club for disinterring me and getting me back on a panel. So we're here to talk about microgrids, and you may have an idea of what that is. We're going to go into what that is. We're going to try to define it. But for now, incorrectly, you can think of it as whatever you want to think of it, as a small grid, although Sally will correct you on that. All of us here most of us here are specialists. I know a lot about solar. Austin is a fuel cell expert. Perhaps Mark has been pitched with 300 battery companies in his life, right? So he knows about polymer electrolytes more than he'd like, right? He's a specialist. However, microgrids could be thought of as really the fullest expression of distributed energy. Maybe not the fullest expression of renewable energy, but certainly one of the fuller expressions of distributed energy. And it's a system. It's no longer a component. It doesn't require so much specialist knowledge on photovoltaics, but it requires the ability to work a system and to make it integrate with the utility. And I think that's one of the things we'll be talking about. It is a little bit disruptive, perhaps, and like all disruptive things, it's going to encourage some conflicts between utilities and customers, also some conflicts between wealthy people who can afford to have a microgrid and renewable energy, and the remaining grid that's left for the people who can't afford a microgrid. So we'll talk about maybe a little bit of that inequity that as well. And so that's my introduction. So what we'll do is we'll hear from all four. We'll go in order: size, age, whatever. Just order, just this direction. And what I'd like you to do is tell me a little bit about your company, and tell me in 50 words or less how you see a microgrid, define your microgrid and why it's important. I know that's a lot to ask. Do it in less than 3 minutes. Bio, a little bit about your company, a little definition of how you see a microgrid and why it's important. Okay, great. Okay, are you Mike? You don't need this.
Okay, good. So my name's Tom Chadwick. I'm the founder of GI Energy. We started the business in the UK and acquired a company in North America in 2011. My background is in telecoms and technology equity research, and I was with Merrill Lynch during the 90s and early 2000s looking at the transformation of the telecom market, where cell phone operators basically disrupted the fixed line operators. And a great deal of what I see going on in this universe here is informed by that experience, and I think we'll come back to that during the debate. But from my position, I think the disruption, the issues, the regulation are all very relevant. I founded GI Energy in 2005, and we've become a distributed energy resources system integrator. As part of that, we've built a number of microgrids. We also have integrated a bunch of other technologies which are complementary. Microgrids, I think probably someone further down the panel will give a more articulate definition, but for me, I just think they're a big part of the energy revolution that we're going to see going on in the next 20 years, which is the migration from centralized power to a more distributed, customer-centric model for energy provision. And I'll leave it at that. But, in terms of providing a customer focus, I think this is the big thing that we're going to see in the next 20 years, a kind of transformation from basically utilities seeing the meter as their customer to actually having real people at the other end with, choices that they want. And I think that's going to be the big exciting part.
Great. Sally, tell us about the Precourt Institute and give us a more articulate.
It won't be more articulate, I promise.
More articulate.
This will be like the elephant. We'll each give you a part, and then you can figure out what the elephant is. So I'm Sally Benson. I am co-director of the Precourt Institute for Energy at Stanford University. I've spent the last 20 years first motivated primarily by climate change mitigation, looking at decarbonization. But as I got more deeply involved in looking at the energy system, got very interested in issues of energy access, of course, energy affordability, or particularly electricity affordability, national security dimension. So really a very holistic, 360-degree view of the energy system and what it will take to get from where we are now to the one we need in the future, which is going to be bigger with a much more diverse set of sources. And if we do our job right, it will also have no carbon. So that's what I think about. So I'll say a little bit about how I think about mini grids or microgrids or nanogrids, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I think in some cases it's just literally what it sounds like, a miniature version of the grid. And the context that's relevant are parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, where people live so far from the grid that the existing grids that it's unlikely that they'll be able to get electricity access soon unless we can provide sort of an alternative, smaller scale version that doesn't require the enormous infrastructure investment to get poles and wires, hundreds or thousands of miles to where people are. So that's one version. It's a small version of a grid, primarily to meet lighting services, heating or cooling, TV, entertainment, cell phone charging, that kind of stuff. Probably not terribly capable of supporting the kind of economies that we think about when we think about a modern, thriving economy. I think there's another completely different version of a microgrid, and I went to a campus in Illinois where they actually have a microgrid, and their intention was to be able to, they have very unreliable electricity there, even though it's right next to Chicago. And they developed a system so they could island themselves. So if they were at risk of losing power, they could island themselves. They've got on-campus generation, and so they can basically be self-sufficient for quite a long time until they want to reconnect to the grid. So I think that's another version of a microgrid playing another very different function. On sort of a completely different extreme is sort of somehow the fundamental notion that it would be desirable perhaps in the future that a neighborhood, for example, might want to be able to isolate itself and be energy independent from a utility or whatever, and basically use local generation and battery storage as an example. So I think those are three very different microgrids motivated by very different things. So big landscape.
Okay, awesome. Of Bloom Energy?
Sure. So just a quick explanation of Bloom. We're a fuel cell technology provider. We provide distributed generation for mostly commercial and industrial customers, as well as some utility customers. For those of you not familiar with fuel cells, essentially it's like a battery that runs all the time with a fuel source. It's a non-combustion resource. In our case, it's a solid oxide fuel cell. Simplest example I can give is we breathe in oxygen and we have hydrocarbons from food and we process those without combusting. That's essentially how our technology works on the same principles. Because we don't have all of those interchanges, it's a highly efficient reaction, but at the same time we have to stay on all the time. And that's a very important aspect of our microgrid offering and how we work in microgrids, providing the 24/7 power requirement as well as the reliability aspect. So that's sort of the context on Bloom. And from a microgrid standpoint, we have all shapes and sizes of microgrids at Bloom, but at the most fundamental level, it has to be an electrical system that can island from the grid for an extended period of time. And when I say an extended period of time, typically that's more than 24 hours if need be. The reason they're important, at least the customer feedback that we get, is we've had an increase in outages in the U.S. that has been tremendous. From 2008 to 2016, it was over 80%. I bet if we added 2017, where we had 5 hurricanes in the span of 2 months, compared to having only 1 or 2 a year at most in the history of the U.S., storms are causing a significant impact. The other big impact that we see with specific customers is time to power, where the utility is not outfitted to provide power in time, so you need more generation resource on site. And then finally, power quality. In a more digital economy, you see folks who need power that is of very high quality. Even a half-second blip can cause a manufacturing issue that could lead to hundreds of thousands of dollars of loss. So those are some of the primary drivers behind it, and we see everything from retail to campuses that we can give examples of later.
Okay. Sally, I have a journalistic background, so I have to ask.
Do I get to go? Or?
No. Journalistic questions. I'll get back to you.
I cede my time to you.
We're going in age order here. Sally, can I ask, the Precourt Institute, who is the, I represent myself. This gentleman represents GI Energy. Mm-hmm. Who funds the Precourt, Precourt Institute?
So the Precourt Institute is an institute that's funded by an endowment from one of our generous alumni to the university. Okay. We have a number of other generous people who provide, individuals who provide resources for seed funding. We also work very extensively with industry. The Precourt Institute is not industry funded per se, but we create partnerships with industry, and that includes a wide list, including oil and gas companies. And you want to hear that?
That was what I wanted to hear.
I knew that. See, I didn't give it to you right away.
So I just wanted to say, this is not extremely super green topic, right? You're all 57% owned by Shell, right?
That's right.
Precourt has oil and gas as its partners. And Bloom is a natural gas powered...
Or biogas.
Or biogas powered product. So, forgive me for making that point. Mark!
I'm green.
Does DVL have any LPs who are oil and gas companies?
Actually, we turned down an oil and gas major for our last fund.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway,
but sorry for that. Anyway, please.
If we didn't have a good track record and weren't successful, then we might have taken their money. That's just how it works. There's self-interest at play at all levels, right? And a lot of the oil and gas majors are making moves, and they realize that they're in a dying industry. So I'm Mark Perutz. I'm a partner with DBL Partners. We're an impact venture capital firm. We only do green and sustainable investments. I know it's always good to have a journalist as the moderator of the panel. And Eric is a great example of why we need to support journalists in this country, because he always drives at the truth, and he won't let you slide by with things. So at DBL, we've been around for 15 years. I've been there for 15 years. We've made 55 investments. About 25% of those have been in clean energy, solar, wind, energy storage, smart grid, and some developers in the space, one of which is AMS, Advanced Microgrid Solutions. As you might guess, they have something to do with microgrids. So my example on the definition for microgrids, and by the way, you said before it was going to be 100 words. In the email we got before the panel, now it's 50 words. And I've used up 10. AMS started off developing energy storage batteries. And the example I give is a light microgrid installation they did. which is in Orange County. The largest water utility there, the Irvine Ranch Water District, serves 400,000 people, brings them their water. And they have a lot of pumps, which require a lot of energy, and they have a lot of water treatment because they both pump clean water and take away and treat the sewage and effluent. And they are a big power consumer, and they also don't, reliability is really important to them. Resilience, which is kind of the underlying definitional theme I would offer for microgrids. If resilience isn't super important to you, it's just going to cost too much for you to spend the time and the money to develop a microgrid.
Well, although there is the application that Sally talked about of rural electrification and hopscotching over power transmission lines.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyway,
right.
So just to cap that, so they deployed 7 megawatts of energy storage, Tesla batteries. Hi, Mark, one of the co-founders, Tesla. And they are going to be used so that when the local grid, Southern California Edison, says, hey, there's too much demand for power right now. I don't need you also, Irvine Water District, to take a bunch of power off of your pumps. They can continue to pump the water because people need the water, and you can't just say, you can't use water day between 2 and 4, or you don't want to say that. They have all these batteries so they don't have to draw energy from the grid. So this is an example of working with the grid as opposed to supplanting it.
An extraordinary amount of California's energy is used to pump water around the state, right? And so, and AMS was specifically looking at water districts as a target customer. So thank you for starting this. That's a typical application for a microgrid. Awesome. Could you give us a quick sketch of one of the microgrids you're involved with? And you have varying degrees of microgriddedness, right?
Sure.
Gridity. But so give us an example, quick idea of one that's on the ground, that's working today.
Sure. So I'll start with one of the first municipal microgrids we worked on, which is the Hartford City microgrid. It actually powers what is the emergency shelter, which is a combination of school, a gas station, and a grocery store, as well as a library for the city of Hartford. I just found out GI Energy actually helped us on the design. Right. I had no idea. And in that case, essentially what ends up happening is, if you think about the way our technology kind of works on that microgrid, is we are in parallel with the grid in most cases, but we're providing all of the critical load requirements of specific facilities. If the grid goes down, for example, in a snowstorm in Connecticut, et cetera, then essentially we still keep operating. So in this case, there might be a slight blink where they're not that concerned about power quality because they just want to essentially have the power back on within, let's call it 30 seconds or so, worst case. And it keeps powering all of the critical facilities for the city. Now, in the case of an emergency, they can use it for multiple purposes, and it keeps the lights on and keeps the warmth on specifically in that scenario.
And the library, for some reason, they thought that it's very nice that the library was part of their essential services, right?
Right, and that's one scale of microgrid. We can talk about some other examples, but we do everything from a Home Depot store being able to island from the grid versus the new Apple campus, which is, I think, is a pretty exciting combination of technologies because it's the first time where you take solar, battery storage, and fuel cells and combine that to be able to run even over 6 months if you have to from a design parameter standpoint.
So these microgrids involve a generation source, right?
Absolutely.
And in your case, it's a fuel cell, but it could also be a microturbine, like a capstone kind of thing. Is there always, I'll ask you, Tom, as well, or Sally, is there always going to be, can a solar panel and a battery system work without a fossil fuel?
A base load.
Without a base load, for lack of a better word, a base load source. So it's I'll take a yes or no answer.
Should I start? Or?
Go.
I would say no.
Okay.
I'll just give you a very quick example, right?
It's not yes or no.
Okay.
No, please.
All right, no. The reason is that the amount of space that you need for the adequate amount of solar, right? It takes 4 acres to get a 1 megawatt of solar, give or take. Bloom, it's 1,500 square feet, and it's also on 24/7 versus not when the sun only shines. So the amount of battery storage and solar you would need for anything that is in the hundreds of kilowatts and above, it would simply have to be more kind of utility substation scale or utility scale in order to provide reliability for extended periods of time. Can you do it for a home for the course of like one day in Florida? Sure, but not beyond that.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I answer that? So you gave the example of a home in Florida. So we looked at 5 locations: Alaska, Florida, New York, Arizona, and Washington State. And we looked at actual solar generation profiles. We looked at realistic load profiles. We looked at 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, and we looked at a sort of typical solar plus battery system that people would install today. And in no one of these cases, including Florida, did you not need power.
Did you look at Hawaii?
We didn't look at Hawaii. And it's not that you need that much. And maybe it's like you can meet everything but like 18% of your load. I mean, it varies from place to place. But that 18%, what are you going to do then? Maybe it's you have wind. So I don't know that it has to be a fossil fuel source, but it's very hard with just the solar battery pairing to make that work.
Tom?
I would agree with the panel. I mean, I think you can get pretty close, and I think one way you can get close is by tying in some other technologies that drive down your load. So, the project that I want to tell you about is one that we're developing in San Francisco at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard. It's a site that's being developed by Lennar, 5-Point major home builder, and they're looking to put 10,500 new homes into downtown San Francisco and about 4 million square feet of real estate. And I need to be very careful here because my client is sitting over there looking at me. So anyway, the long and the short of it is we're working with them to put in effectively a microgrid. The big difference is it will be connected to the grid. And we're going to drive a huge amount of the power from solar and battery storage. And we're going to drive down the load materially by putting a community-scale thermal grid into the program at the same time. The combination of those two things allows us to get pretty close to a kind of net zero alternative, but not quite.
So like a district heating type
Yes, it will be a district heating using effectively large-scale ground source heat pumps. And, we're going to be able to, get very, very close. We will continue to have the site connected to the grid, and the grid has a very valuable, part to play in all this. What we are going to be able to do is probably, provide critical sites within that community and provide, the kind of smaller pockets of microgrid within that are able to sustain themselves. But it's an exciting project. It's certainly going to be very groundbreaking, and it's I think a great example of the importance of integrating other technologies into these solutions that actually reduce your load.
Tom, you said it was a microgrid, but sort of.
Well, because I think the definition, particularly as Sally's point is, it needs to have
single point of
have the capacity to be islanded. And I think microgrids do tend to have this kind of rather kind of variable definition. So, but clearly being able to island is I think a big part of it. So it's kind of nearly a microgrid, I would say.
Okay. So I don't think we
I'll
have
jump
any.
in with one quick one on that. I think I agree that you couldn't do it today, but you could do it if money was no object and you had a small office building like this that didn't have a lot of floors and wasn't running a factory, didn't have a huge load, and just had a few lights and computers and stuff plugged in, and you just bought enough batteries, and then you ran the solar all day, you put into the batteries, discharge the batteries at night, and then you'd have to replace the batteries with the current battery technology after 4, 5, 6, 7 years, depending on how many batteries you got.
There are some edge cases where it would work, but
yeah,
by
so
and large, it's not going to work.
It's just not cost effective.
Okay. You talked about money being no object just for a second. Navigant, choose some analyst's house, some unreputable analyst house, like the one I used to work for, and get a currently work for. I shouldn't really insult them. And get a market forecast. You get $31 billion by 2027 is the size of the microgrid market. But that money is not newly minted. That money is money that companies would be spending for their energy. So where is that money, that $31 billion, where would that normally be spent? Do you understand my question, right? This is not just sudden new billionaires spending money on microgrids. Apple has a limited amount of money they can spend. They either spend it on microgrids or they just pay their utility kilowatt-hour prices. So I guess I'd like to understand that. Does that question make sense?
Sure.
Okay, Mark.
Well, Apple does kind of have an unlimited amount of money. I mean, it depends on who's got the money and what they want to do with it, right? So Apple's got all this capital, and they're trying to figure out how they can make it work. Now they can repatriate it. And they look at it like a lot of private equity firms look at money, which is where can I make money? To make it in real estate or the public markets or international stocks. And more, and we've seen Carlyle come and announce a big microgrid fund. Macquarie is in it in a big way. These are big, private equity firms are going to invest in anything under the sun, and they're choosing, they're seeing an opportunity that, hey, there's been a lot of renewables been deployed, there's a lot of storms, as Austin talked about, a lot more concern about resilience. Energy storage has had a lot of advances in terms of cost and performance, and maybe there's an opportunity to spend money to own and operate resilient microgrid systems. And I think that's a lot of new money coming into the space that would have been spent on the stock market or some other sort of thing.
But it's hard to make that value case. So when you're trying to sell a customer on a microgrid, how do you, other than resiliency and 5 nines, how do you put a value on this? It's pretty crucial to making money in this industry.
Sure. I mean, our value proposition is that we look at certain segments of the market, and they're the real estate developers like Lennar who look at the idea that they've got to make a certain infrastructure investment into their communities, and if they weren't putting in a microgrid of some sort, they would still need to be putting in wires and lines and so on and so forth, and they would be spending that money themselves. What we're offering them basically is a plug-and-play solution that we will own. So we can take a huge chunk of capital out of their capital stack with Shell's balance sheet, which we can then own the asset for 30, 40 years and operate it. And the real estate developer then doesn't need to deploy capital on something which is a non-core part of their business. They have the kind of confidence that the residents of the community will then have a reliable project that's owned by GI Energy / Shell. So that's one side of it. And there are plenty of people out there that also want to avoid spending capital. And the university campus market is an enormous marketplace. There are 4,500 universities in North America, all of whom have got very ambitious sustainability targets. And putting in a microgrid on that scale is potentially a very good way of cutting their carbon emissions, meeting their energy goals, and so on and so forth. But it comes at a price, and actually universities don't necessarily want to spend $1 billion on a microgrid. Engie, one of our competitors, has just bought the Ohio State university campus assets for $1 billion. That's a check that they're happy to write, and Ohio State's very happy to put that back into their endowment, and spend it on education. So I think there is a direction, where the money will come from, and there are certain parts of the community that will, be natural targets and meet initially.
Let me just change direction slightly. I don't know if we have any utility people in the room, but by and large, utilities don't love microgrids. Is that reasonable to say? One, they don't get to sell you that power. That's their business, is selling kilowatt hours, so they're not extremely happy about that. Even worse, when you're islanding, you're busy switching on and off 50-megawatt loads onto their grid. And so if all of a sudden they lose 50 megawatts. Well, they have to turn on something to make up that 50 megawatts if you're putting power onto the grid, and vice versa, right? So it plays havoc with the grid. And we've heard about tariffs that utilities are imposing. So if you want a microgrid, you have to pay up for the maintenance of this grid, even though you're defecting from the grid. So I guess you have to learn to play well with utilities if you're going to be in the microgrid business, right? You're going to have to work with them because it's not in their best interest for you to go off grid or for you to just toggle on and off this islanding thing. Yes, and so Sally, have you looked at this type of impact on the grid?
I haven't looked at that. I want to make another remark, and I don't know whether you're going to ask me to make this remark, so I'm just going to go ahead and
proactive. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I need to share where my perspective comes from. I spent my teenage years living in Pakistan, and I lived in Islamabad, beautiful new city. We had perfectly fine power, but most of the country, 85% of the country had no electricity. I go back there every year. I go to India a lot, and most people, half people in rural areas don't have power. People in the cities have very unreliable power. And what they want more than anything in terms of energy is a reliable electricity grid. And so my view of the world is that, part of being part of a modern economy is to have access to very, very high power quality. And if you look at what do people do in those countries, Pakistan, India, many parts of the world, anyone who can afford it, they buy a diesel generator. Maybe nowadays they buy PV panels. They're paying for fuel. They're spending a fortune on energy. And so they take care of themselves. So there's very little investment in, money left over to invest in a countrywide infrastructure. So if we look at the U.S. context right now, and microgrids and mini grids, and I just call it the energy independence point of view, is I have this real worry we're migrating back towards a disinvestment in what was a shared common good, which made our whole country be able to have everybody have equal access. And so I think that there are real concerns about this disinvestment by no longer purchasing power through utilities that puts us in a position where poor people will be disadvantaged. No one will make big long-term infrastructure bets because you're just not certain whether there'll be a client. So I just think we need to think very carefully about the decisions we're making. And just to give some other examples, would we want to be sewage independent? Would we want to be garbage independent? Would we want not to have a common public highway infrastructure? We wouldn't. That's not the country I want to live in. And I think electricity is one of those things that is just so foundational. So doing things that put at risk shared infrastructure is a real concern of mine.
Okay. All right. I mean, there's a couple of panels there, which we're probably not going to get into, right? I mean, really. I would like to ask Sally a question, but awesome. Tell me.
Well, I think we've talked about the opportunity cost of the capital to finance these projects, but the way the business case, and unfortunately, regardless of how much money a customer has, at least from my job's perspective, there's always an exhaustive business case as to how you're going to justify it. And that does include what are they spending on the utility today. And then on top of that cost is a question of what is the opportunity cost of reliability for that customer, which very few customers are willing to pay until after an event actually happens in most cases. Or they're going to look at what is the cost of diesel generators or UPS or batteries or conventional backup and layer that into the business case. So yes, the financial justification, especially in the case of, I would say most microgrids who are always on, which are the ones we tend to power, is going to be the offset of taking that, getting less expensive power than what you're paying today as a customer. And also looking at the volatility of rate structures, is a big issue for customers over time, which is a regulatory process they do not control. And then also looking at what is that reliability quotient. Now, but not all microgrids are created equal. Some utilities like certain kinds of microgrids. So, for example,
the ones they might own,
and I think that's where we will end up going in some ways. We're already seeing hybrid models of that. In Brooklyn, Queens, with Con Ed gave us the incentives to deploy with their customers. They offset upgrading $1 billion substation with a $400 million distributed generation plus demand response plus other programs to reduce load while putting in DG. So that's sort of an example of the hybrid grid of the future emerging. Our biggest financiers are utilities, Constellation, Southern Company, et cetera, who are now looking at the behind the world meter and saying, you know what, we have to innovate for our customers. How can we invest in this in different ways? So it's not a binary bad for the utility, good for the customer type situation. It is sophisticated, and the regulatory constructs are still developing. There's a microgrid bill that just passed the California legislature, which is going to require utilities to interconnect. So regulators are a huge part of this process. CPUC is going to come up with what the regulations look like, but essentially such that you cannot prevent a microgrid from interconnecting.
Okay. I see the good points. I don't want to forget Sally's dystopian future of me having to steal gas tankers and eat dog food while there's cloistered communities with five nines power. So, Mark, we have about 15 more minutes for Q&A. One of DBL's portfolio companies, a company you're involved with, is AMS, Advanced Microgrid Systems.
Solutions.
Advanced Microgrid Solutions. The question I'm really asking is, where are we at? Are we still in the super nascent, give me a grant so I can build this thing, it's a pilot project purgatory forever? Is that where we are in microgrids? And tell me that in the context of the saga that AMS has gone through.
Yeah, sure. And I'll kind of weave in a response to Sally's kind of potential dystopian view, and you need people to kind of be the watchdogs for that. So I think that most microgrids want to stay grid connected. They don't want to be off grid. They don't want to be island all the time. It's their cost advantage to be connected. So that's point number one. I don't see a huge trend in that respect. Point number two is these things take forever to build and deploy, these microgrids. Whether they're just storage or storage plus cogeneration, these are 2-year, 3-year, 5-year projects when you talk about planning and budgeting and all that sorts of stuff. The interconnect, the permitting, it just takes forever. They're super expensive, and a lot of times if you deploy a lot of batteries, it's not going to get used that much. And what you need to do is find other uses to pay for that battery. And the utility is the main person, the main buyer you'd be talking to. So the same example I had with the Irvine Ranch Water District. It's a microgrid, and their biggest source of revenue is a local utility, Southern California Edison. And Southern California Edison, this is only for not using Southern California Edison's energy. What they can do in the future is actually discharge the storage that they have, the 7 megawatts, 34 megawatt hours. They can discharge that into the grid when the utility wants it. And the utility will come and want it because they'll say, hey, you've got this batteries. You don't need all of it for grid backup. Give me some of it for frequency support or voltage support or ramping or some other sort of use. In terms of AMS, which is one of the pioneers in this space along with STEM, in terms of deploying storage-centered microgrids. It is pioneers have a hard time. They have to blaze the trail. And as they won 40, 50 megawatt contracts with big utilities, but those they were first-time contracts, and the CPUC didn't know how to regulate and approve them. The local utility didn't know how to turn them on and deal with interconnect. And they also had to assemble a whole bunch of host customers for siting, and they did it in tandem with the utility to say to the utility, where are your hotspots? Where do you have too much load at certain times of the day or too much generation? and let me work with you to find customers, businesses, municipal buildings, where I can put the batteries that will be helpful to you, and then you'll pay me the most amount of money for the help that I'm giving you. And this whole process has taken a really long time. AMS started off as a developer, so they kind of find all the players, put them all together, and do all the work of building, being the general contractor, if you will, to manage all of it and put it together. And if you're a pioneer and you're doing new systems, it takes 5 years instead of the 2 that you thought. And as a venture-backed company, you don't have tens of millions of dollars to pay for your overhead.
How much did they raise totally? $35 million in the round B, I think, something like that?
Something like that, yeah. So, those are all the downsides of AMS. The positive side is when you're fumbling around a bit, trying to find the right combination of what the market needs and the product market fit, you have the best insights to figure that out, because you've been suffering as a pioneer in that space, and you've realized what takes too long and what's a cash flow negative business, and what people are willing to pay for and how much, and where the value is going to accrue across the entire stream from, the developer of the project to the hardware to the software to the EPC or the systems integrators who are building it to the end owner. You've built all the spreadsheets, you've deployed it, and you have a very good sense, which most people don't today. They don't know. Back to your original question, people don't know how lucrative it is going to be to own microgrids. And it's different every time. Everyone is different. And a lot of these private equity firms are getting into it because they think they can get at least 15% annual returns from their money being deployed in the space. But they don't know, but they're so big, and this is such a potential opportunity that they have to play in it, and they're willing to take the risk with these initial small projects.
Okay.
Can I reply to something about the grid-connected part?
You don't have to ask permission.
Yeah. Okay. So I understand that, and I'm not against microgrids. I was just trying to point out this other concern about shared infrastructure. But so say you are grid-connected, but you generate most of your electricity locally. And so maybe you need 15% of your energy over the course of the year from the grid. And if you're largely solar generation, which is sort of where we head in California, the whole state can completely lack, solar resources in a day, or half the state, which is like, 15 gigawatts during the middle of a day. And so the question is when we all need power the day that the sun is out, we're going to need a lot of power from a centralized grid. But we only need it very infrequently. Who's going to pay to maintain that infrastructure that gives us all that backup when we only use it a small amount of the time? The math just doesn't work out. It takes a lot of infrastructure to maintain that system. And if 85% of the time we're not writing any checks to pay for that system, how do we come up with that? Now, maybe storage gets much better, and we don't have to worry about that in the future, but studies today suggest that if you want to have multi-day storage, you need to get down in the 10 cents or $10 a kilowatt hour. And we're a long, long way from that. We're 10x, 20x from that.
Sally, can I attempt to answer that? I think there's a couple of things, that give me a great deal of optimism about the uncomfortable interface of the grid and the microgrid. In the end, the next 20 years is going to see a huge increase in electricity demand because of electric vehicles, but also air conditioning is going to pretty much rise across most markets because of climate change, and it's just a fact. We've got to live with it, and it's expensive to run and needs to be addressed. So there's going to be more electricity in the marketplace. The second thing, I think is that that the sophistication, and all the kind of technology and the data and the integration of the technology that you can get allows you to balance those imbalances. So, those kind of peaks that have been a function of having a decentralized grid can be smoothed out once you start to have a much more sophisticated set of interconnected, assets, whether they're microgrids, whether they're solar farms, and so on and so forth, wind farms, battery storage. Those peaks that you're worried about costing a huge amount to service are actually going to be eradicated in that investment over the next 20 years because you're able to deal with a great deal of that imperfection with the technology.
I'm not worried about the time of day peaks. I'm worried about 3 days where we don't have sunshine in California.
But you're worried about that, and that can be, and you're worried about someone having to pay for it, and that being, people that largely can't afford to pay for it because they haven't had the luxury of having their own little microgrid that protects them. And the answer is, if it's regulated properly, much like the telecom sector, and I saw this, money was taken out of the the market through licenses, in fact, in the telecom space for cell phones, and actually used to enhance the overall networks and so on and so forth. So it was a great kind of outcome.
Yeah, well, I hope you're right. Yeah, I hope
Let me ask one last quick question. In the audience, we have a CEO of a startup who's doing thermal energy storage. On the topic of startups, Mark, do you see startups addressing this industry? Grid control software or making SCADA systems talk to other systems with other language, making distributed energy resources, DERS, such a horrible acronym, talk to other DERS speaking different languages.
There's a healthy ecosystem of players in this general microgrid area or DERS area. I think that there's going to be less venture-backed startups who are pure developers, like AMS started. I think they're kind of moving away from it, and it's a tough space for a small company to be in, even more larger companies.
Well, and so Susan Kennedy, the CEO of, said that a project company doesn't scale. This is a quote from the CEO of your portfolio company. I didn't make it up. So that's why they're no longer a project company, right? They have become a platform company. Is that correct? So
they've shifted from being a developer of these projects where you work with utilities, answer RFPs, and then go and find big, Apple or Irvine Corporation or somebody, and
5 years later, you finally.
Yeah, I think that it's those projects take a long time and require a lot of capital in your entity, and they're best served by larger entities. I think that there's more venture-backed companies in battery innovation and really in the software innovation, which is where AMS has shifted.
Okay. I hope that you learned a little bit about microgrids. You can obviously see that there's unanswered questions about the technology, about the value proposition, about financing, and about social inequity and the impact on the grid. These questions really remain to be answered. So we have some time left. If you have some questions, here's some resources. Ask them now. Judith.
My name is Judith Schwartz. I'm a consultant to the point who works in a lot of low-income work and customer engagement, and I want to bring up the issue relative to the point that Sally made about equity. So one of the utility-funded microgrids that is considered very valuable is Borrego Springs, done by San Diego Gas and Electric. And I would argue that one of the reasons it seems it delivers value is because it's not just one customer who's invested in it who gets the value. It's this whole area in their territory that can be isolated when there's a really bad storm and they're cut off from everything. And it seems to me that, to your point, Sally, it's that where the value really comes in is if it's not just distributed investment by a private entity for their own benefit, but rather something that can be islanded and continue running in a case of an emergency, where you can then bring people in and have a place to provide resources. that those are the kinds of projects that really add value in the greater scheme of things. And if we look at what are the kinds of things we're doing to support those from a regulatory standpoint, that's really the distinction. If it just helps Apple run their campus, I don't really see why everybody else should have to support that. If it's doing something where there's a place that if in Palo Alto the lines got hit again, and we were stuck, what could you do to enable a place where people could go to deal with the fact that there wouldn't be power because, a plane knocked out the substation this time instead of one line?
So sure, we're going to need the PUC to be involved in order to make this work, right?
Yeah, I think I would just add to that because we're seeing more action from the utilities wanting to get engaged. And one of the challenges we have from a regulatory construct standpoint is when we dereg, we told the distribution companies that they can't own generation assets. So what ends up happening is even though you can make a really strong business case down in the distribution level of the grid, the utility is not allowed to own the asset, therefore they can't purchase it. Then they need to do a PPA, which is not their core competency.
They can't rate base that.
They can't rate base it, so their incentives are not aligned. So one of the things that we do have to figure out is as all of these technologies come down the cost curve, that's the most exciting aspect of it. The reason we're seeing microgrids is because they're cost-effective technologies that can generate cleanly on-site in a reliable fashion. And they've finally come to the point where they are now they're measuring up behind the meter, but they will progress to be able to go deeper into the distribution system if you can attribute some locational benefit value to it. There's no reason why you wouldn't have a neighborhood with batteries, solar, fuel cells that can power a set of EVs charging when need be and power the neighborhood during an outage scenario and take pressure off the transmission system. There's no reason for that besides the economics and the regulatory aspect.
Okay.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing? We talk a lot about California and affordability in the California context. Our industrial customers pay twice as much for electricity as a typical, U.S. in California. Our residential customers pay 50% more. Our commercial customers pay 75% more. So I think that we need to bear in mind California is very expensive for these products, and I think we should really be working on making California's electricity much less expensive. And the great news is we've got low-cost utility-scale solar where there are bids you can get at 1.5 to maybe 2 cents a kilowatt hour now. We should be able to have really inexpensive power here in California, so we should be working on that. And to the extent that locational, investment of assets in the distribution system can help make the overall system more resilient and cheaper, by all means, we should be going after that in a big way.
All right, so I'm not completely informed on this, but somebody can give me an example of the 1 or 2 times that utilities have lowered their prices.
But bills are different in California. They're the lowest in the nation, but the second lowest, so it matters what the bill is, not just...
Sure.
Well, to the residential customer.
So even though we have high kilowatt-hour pricing, we have low net billing because of, our weather and efficiencies.
Yeah, but the more people who move to the Central Valley of California, which have large air conditioning demands, so we're going to see the higher demand. But you're right that for that residential customer, we pay about the same amount.
Zero net energy.
Sure. So,
but they're still getting their nighttime power from the grid.
Okay. Several more panels here about the existential threat to utilities. Next question. Yes, Eric.
Well, thank you. So I work for Willdan. It's a company that's NASDAQ traded. We're in the thanks. We're in the BQDM, the Brooklyn, Queens. Do a lot more energy efficiency right now, but we want to do all the things that are represented in the panel. I happen to be working on a project where I have a very small footprint for the building because there's a whole bunch of energy efficiency done and reducing the demand. So, and I'm going to put on photovoltaics, put in a battery control system, electric vehicle just a simple bolt. And so with that, though, the payback investment tax credit, SCHIP, 3.4 years. Okay, so that's because the building done so much on it. It's a thermal mass building, no AC in a harsh summer environment. But the combined, I don't hear, and what I work on is trying to figure out how we put the pieces together: energy efficiency, demand response, distributed generation, storage, et cetera, so that we can really see how the economics work. The distribution piece, I'm in 8 proceedings of California, including the distribution resource plan. When we pull all those things together, I think we can see a very different thing. And then I'm making notes that if you have notice, load limit, curtail, island, re-energize that building for the grid when it's needed, and it can be off-grid as well. You integrate that. It's a very different picture. So the problem, utility rate base, investor on utilities, they don't want to do it. You've got a huge amount of resistance from the utilities to do these more intelligent, capable now solutions. So how do we pull these silos together is my...
Okay, I was going to ask you to phrase your question in the form of a question.
How do we pull the silos together?
As a developer, do you have a corporate strategy for integrating, orchestrating all of these voices?
I mean, our company is,
You did say the more complicated the project it is, the better, the easier it is that you can make money from it, right?
It is. It is. It's absolutely, and the technology is getting cheaper, and the ability to, bring down all the things that you say, manage the load, and you can create projects that work. But, the point is, how do you scale that? How do you bring that into a wider scale so that, Sally isn't anxious that, the marginal consumer is being, disadvantaged and priced out. And, one of the things that, we've got to recognize is we are at the very start of this journey. And, there are companies, all across North America and the world, getting to grips with how to deliver efficiency through the microgrid and all the other resources and bring technology to bear. At some point, there's going to be an aggregation of those resources, which then shares all that R&D and burnt through capital that lots of entrepreneurs have burnt through and had poor experiences and good experiences, and ultimately there will be an aggregation, and that's when the regulator needs to come together and actually put a measured rollout of the greater system, so that these things actually, become widely adopted. Because at the minute, there are probably 500 microgrids in North America. It's tiny. It's a fraction. We're not even there, and some of them make money and some of them don't. But I think in the end, you'll get, network orchestrators, companies possibly like Shell, some of the other big technology companies, probably some of the utilities that will actually put all these things together and share the love with, the wider community.
So I just want to add and give you an example. I mean, when you're doing a greenfield build today, you can really do some dramatic things. So the most dramatic example I have is the PayPal data center in Salt Lake City, competing against 6-cent power. Data centers are the fastest growing electric energy use in the world, about 8%, 6 to 8%, give or take, even with all of the energy efficiency and innovation, with a 50% cost structure based on electricity. So if you look at that data center, we essentially worked with them where they built a data center without diesel, without UPS, without battery. Now, how do you do that on a 10-megawatt scale and justify the economics against 6-cent power? Because data centers usually get built where there is typically not very clean, dirty power. We did that based on actually shrinking the size of the data center itself, the white space required for the battery systems, et cetera, built all of that into the business case, the diesel testing, the people who have to be there, an emissions reduction compared to the grid there of 40% constantly. So it helped on the sustainability front, it helped on the cost front, And the way a CFO at a customer looks at it is they say, well, now at least I'm not sole sourced based on the utility power prices and how they move. I have essentially a portfolio of investment. So the utility in that case couldn't provide the power fast enough for the data center to scale. And we see that in numerous instances, and not only for data centers, but for manufacturing. Less so in the US. India is a market where we see that a lot more. But there are instances where you can collaborate very well, and especially in greenfield situations. There's no reason why we shouldn't have a lot more DC power. Fuel cell produces DC power. Batteries are on DC. Solar is DC. If you were to design a building of the future, you would do it that way. Unfortunately, 99% of the world is still brownfield, so those are just few and far between, but it will come.
Another question.
Hi. In terms of the relationship between microgrids and utilities, I'd be interested to hear if any of you see differences in incentives for the implication of these kinds of collaborations on an international scale, whether in more progressive sort of European markets or in emerging markets where maybe there's more of a push factor.
I'll take the emerging markets side. Our fund is invested in a company called, used to be called Off-Grid Electric. It's now called Zola. And they do off-grid solar plus storage plus energy-efficient appliances like lighting and cell phone chargers, clocks and TVs. And it's a totally different world and a totally different panel to talk about that. But that's where these nanogrids and mini-grids make a lot of sense, because the one house off-grid system is really limited in terms of what it can do. So it makes a lot more sense to have a whole interconnected village where they're all interconnected. But you need kind of the next level of grid forming inverters to be able to make that an AC power grid as opposed to a DC power, and to sync all of the different nodes together. And that's starting to come out. Folks like Enphase and others are producing that and doing partnerships with other players in the space. So I think that, and it takes forever to get to all the rural areas of a lot of these countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia. So the mini-grid or the nanogrid is really a huge growth area, because these are not people who are saying, well, I want resiliency, or I just feel like having control over my own power. They just don't have any power.
I need to heat my pool.
Yeah, right. They don't have any power, or they're using kerosene or wood to create that lighting. So that's a huge growth area.
But it's obviously two different worlds that we're addressing here, right? There's money is no object, 5/9's resiliency, and then there's just solar lamps and solar appliances, right? Did that help? Okay. Awesome.
Well, it's a market we've looked at from more of a business development standpoint. It is very different. The rules and incentive structures are very different. And because of the Germany example, there's a bit of a, I shouldn't say pause, but I guess it is kind of a pause in that market, because what ended up happening is, even though they went 50% renewable, their CO2 footprint didn't really improve materially.
And their prices have gone up.
And their prices have gone up, and a lot of utilities almost went out of business and spun off components. So there's a little bit of uncertainty there, and Brexit doesn't help at the same time. Unfortunately, the EU's got regulations on CHP, on-site generation, and all of those things in a very detailed manner, but which makes it, at least as a company trying to enter the market, much harder. Korea is a much easier example for us, because it's much more streamlined on that front.
Yeah, Phil Keys with a company called Intertrust. Earlier in the discussion, you talked about the current need for some sort of CO2-based generation that puts out CO2. California and Hawaii have just said that they're going to go to 100% carbon-free. Do you think there's going to be a point where that will be an issue with microgrid growth, or by that time there'll be enough carbon-free, cheap generation that won't be an issue?
Can I answer that? Can I give it a shot? First of all, I love the idea. I'm not on this panel, I'm just the moderator, but I'll editorialize for a second. I love the idea that California, Hawaii are interested in 100% renewable. There's a law, I think it's Sayre's law. It means that academic arguments are so horrible because the stakes are so low, right? That's what I think is happening here. Why should we care whether we're at 80 or 90%? We're at 14% today in California, okay? Talk to me when we're at 50 and 60.
I thought we were at 30%.
Okay, we're at 30. The next couple of percentage points are going to be...
that's renewable generation.
That's not the actual...
That's not CO2.
Anyway, I just think that, yes, it will be impossible to get rid of the last couple of percentage points of fossil fuel in California, Hawaii, or everywhere. And that will be a victory when we're making that, when we're having that problem. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I think the challenge there is that we look at the world as renewable good, fossil fuel bad. Now, yes, there's challenges with CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, but if you use a fossil fuel, because, Eric and I have had this debate for about 8 years, 10 years, sorry. So when we use natural gas, we don't combust it, and we emit less CO2 because it's far more efficient than conventional power plants, about 50% less than the U.S. grid and 20% less than the California grid. But you're producing power 24/7. So 1 megawatt of solar displaces about 1.3 million pounds of CO2 a year in California. For Bloom, it's about 1 million. I'm giving Bloom as an example as a low-carbon resource because the rules aren't written for low-carbon resources right now. But the objective is to reduce greenhouse gases. Renewables are fantastic. We partner with renewables all the time.
I think we're promoting here, right? I think we're actually promoting.
I'm not promoting. But I'm just saying you started the discussion with saying microgrids is questionable whether they're clean or green, right? And we fundamentally do believe that it has to be clean and green and has to reduce the CO2 footprint. So even if let's say there's another generator that comes along that has the same efficiency as we do, my math would still be the same.
168.
Right, exactly. So a low carbon resource can also offset emissions dramatically comparatively. And by the way, the biggest reduction in CO2 footprint of the U.S. has happened during switching to efficient natural gas resources, not renewables, thus far. So,
yeah, I would second that. I want to go back to one point, though. I mean, some of the idea that microgrids are green and big grids aren't green, I don't think that's true either. I mean, utility scale renewable resources, wind and solar or hydro, are as green as it gets. So just because you might not see that we want to disinvest in the utility scale system doesn't mean we're not in favor of zero emissions or whatever the target is.
I'd like to second that. I'd say that, to answer your question, I agree that microgrids are less green and less renewable because you need the base load to make it work. And with all due respect,
non-Bloom microgrids, sure.
Bloom is cleaner, but it's still emitting, all that fuel gets turned into carbon. So I think the future, you tend to kind of Sally's raised concern of, are we moving from a grid to just a bunch of microgrids? And I think that's incompatible with the goal of getting to 100% renewables, to the man's question. And I think that it's going to be, particularly without the cogeneration aspect. I know you guys are thinking about adding that, but that'll help because you want to get the energy from the heat for the heating and cooling as well. But I think it's another reason why microgrids are not going to take over the grid. They're not going to. It's going to be a small portion. And one other thing on that is that, folks like Apple and Microsoft, some of the campuses, the corporate campuses that want to go, threat to go microgrid and threat to go off the grid, they're also at the same time committing to 100% renewable goals, right? Mm-hmm. So that's, if they're going to go microgrid and go island, you just can't do that and be 100% renewable.
So I do want to challenge that point for just a sec. So one of the renewables that we haven't talked about is biomass or biogas, right? The Apple microgrid is actually 100% renewable because they source biogas from landfills and use that as the input fuel, right? And as a world that's going to have over 10 billion people soon, we are going to have a lot more waste, period. And biogas and biomass, as well as carbon capture, are some things that are on the radar. I mean, we already announced a product to run, a prototype that we're running to take direct biogas from landfills, etc. So,
but you don't have to burn it. You can capture the biogas and then sequester it. You don't have to burn it.
But you can
burning
actually,
it is part of the problem.
But it's not burning; it's non-combustion.
Turning gas into CO2 and putting in the atmosphere is a huge problem. And we need to fix it.
Right, but biogas is considered renewable because otherwise it would have been emitted anyways.
It shouldn't be considered renewable.
Just as a quick note, if you're ever a moderator, this is what you want. You want people fighting.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I just want to come back to what we're thinking and down the road at Hunter's Point. But the ability to really achieve these goals needs to be seen in a kind of more holistic way. And sure, a microgrid may or may not get you there. Or, in my view, it will get you pretty close. But where it gets you very close is because you then have to really focus on the efficiencies of the actual underlying, buildings. And, actually, Stanford is a great example. They've got one of the, most sophisticated, thermal grids, alongside. And, my point is, we're investing very heavily in, geothermal heating and cooling, and that is a phenomenal kind of complementary technology that basically sits alongside these microgrids and actually creates the balance that you need to reduce that load and ultimately achieve those goals. So it's the electrification of the grid, sure, but it's also the load reduction, and we haven't even scratched the surface in terms of the load reduction capabilities. And what we see is most buildings, if they were actually designed a little more efficiently, can actually achieve massive reductions. And we've only just started scraping the surface in terms of the control systems. And there's a company that we're working with at the moment that has put a control algorithm, an artificial intelligence control algorithm, on top of a regular Johnson control system. They've got quite an efficient building. They've taken a further 23% off the energy load just by putting artificial intelligence into that building in Manhattan. And, those kind of things are out there. And, that's where you're really going to be able to achieve these carbon reduction goals. So I'm afraid I'm far more optimistic about it than maybe, the rest of the panel. And I'm seeing real scope to achieve these kind of targets.
Yeah, I don't mean that I'm pessimistic about the targets. I just think it's how we get there is really the issue. And I agree, these these heating and integrated heating and cooling systems, Stanford reduced its emissions. Oh, this is a pitch, I guess, by 68%. And we bought a 68 megawatt PV array that produces all of our daytime power, and we sell a whole bunch. We're just about to make another acquisition to go to 100%. Renewable energy, and so huge things can happen. We also participated in the PG&E capacity bidding program because we have huge thermal storage. That's I'd love to talk with you about your project on Hunters Point about thermal storage, and we could show you how well that worked.
There's even we'll get to you in a second, but with the EV penetration rising, we don't talk about it a lot, and it's still theoretical. But V2G. All of a sudden, if you have a campus with, what's the Stanford bus, the Marguerite bus, if you have 100 of those, 200 of those, and they're all electric, and you have 100-kilowatt batteries sliding around your campus on a very knowable schedule. You know when they're on, you know when they're off. You have an enormous virtual power plant in that kind of regard, if that's cheap enough to make happen. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Ma'am?
Just a quick, another optimistic comment. And this was with regard to energy access and microgrids for the developing world. I think we could argue that they actually are net positive for the environment, for climate change, at least where we're hoping to operate soon. Because when you put a solar or a hybrid solar with microgrid with a small backup with diesel, you're preventing the need for deforestation and diesel and candles and all these other fossil fuel and kerosene. So for the environment, it's a positive, and also the cost is going to be much lower for even the very poorest consumer to pay a little bit for electricity than it is to buy all those expensive fossil fuels. So I want to keep on the positive note here.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I spent a lot of time teaching and working on those kind of projects, and it's life changing. Microgrids in that context are fantastic, and they can even be designed to be grid connected if the grid ever gets to where they are.
that's what we would hope exactly. Thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering to pile on to what Tom said earlier. There seems there's a lot of still energy waste, despite a lot of education about that. And would microgrids, besides their virtue of perhaps lowering carbon, would microgrids be less accelerated if there was a big push toward conserving energy? I think there's something like 40 to 60% of the energy produced is wasted. So I just wanted to know about how conservation and microgrids are sort of going to be able to come up together.
I think the ability to put in smart controls and so on, smart controls, that allow you to kind of very simply the Nest, at the basic level, but that allows you to work more efficiently within a microgrid. And people, once you've actually got control of the data and you can actually see it in real time, and then you can actually start to put artificial intelligence working alongside in that, then you can really drive efficiencies. So the answer is, I think, when you start to take the meter that was the utilities customer back in the last 100 years and actually replace it with a real customer that really actually can react to information, then you start to really, get people excited. Once people can see that they're saving a few dollars, and it's on a panel in their wall, they get very excited and animated, and they want to save more, and they want to play around, and they want to kind of engage with it. Whereas if it just comes, once a quarter in a piece of paper through the mail, it's less exciting. And energy is pretty dull. So, you can make it much more exciting, and you can get people rather engaged with it, when you actually convert it from some kind of kilowatt or electron into a kind of dollar bill. So the answer is, by creating a customer awareness, and that can come through having microgrids.
I was actually thinking more along the lines of, if there are utilities, electric utilities that are concerned of the development of microgrids, are they going to be pushing a lot harder for customers to conserve electricity now and be more efficient to actually try to stall the development of microgrids?
Well, that's the energy efficiency panel. Next week. So we're going to wrap it up. I'd like to thank the panelists. It turns out we're also, Churchill is sponsored by Shell, so I'm just a stooge for the oil and gas industry. I'll skip that last sentence. It won't go on the record. And thanks to Ford for providing the venue.
Thank you very much, Eric. Appreciate you guiding the conversation so well. And Tom, Sally, awesome. Mark, thank you for sharing your opinions so candidly. We really appreciate it. As a small gift for you, we have, of course, the much coveted Churchill Club speaker T-shirt. Please wear that in very good health.
Thank you very much.
And it is true that Shell has been a long-term partner of ours, probably since I began as CEO almost 11 years ago. And we know them to be a company that is interested in more and cleaner energy, and they have a program called Powering Progress Together that will be here in the Bay Area for the second year next April. The Powering Progress Together part is represented as well in this program because they've supported this conversation, enabled it, and there's another one that they will be supporting next month around carbon management. So keep an eye out for that, and we hope you'll join us. A recording of this program will be available on our YouTube channel before long. It will come from Ford's headquarters, so it may take a day or so. But thanks again very much to Shell and Greenfield Labs. We are going to serve lunch for you now, so we hope you'll stick around and continue the conversation out in the lobby informally. Thank you so much for coming. You've been a wonderful audience. See you next time.